After the announcement of the Citadel DLC for Mass Effect 3, all hell broke loose in every facet of the internet. But as usual, the bulk of the action happened on Twitter. The brief description of the DLC set everybody into a frenzy of confusion, speculation, and anger, yet Bioware staff appeared to be completely unaware of the issue. Well, one Twitter follower going by the name of Chris Irwood took it upon himself to question one of Bioware's community managers, Jessica Merzin, after she posted a tweet stating that the Citadel DLC would not contain post-ending content. Chris responded with this: "I thought we were told Bioware were listening to fan feedback on this one." To which Merzin responded, "We did, and the numbers did all the talking. You are not in the majority, despite what you may believe." But Merzin is sadly mistaken. Not wanting to leave poor Chris to fight all the wolves off by himself, we stepped in and took over. The end result was Jessica Merzin blowing off our and the comments of every other angry respondent by basically saying, "We did research that nobody saw, we're right, you're wrong." Ever since the release of the Extended Cut DLC, the debates between the supporters of the endings and those who hated the endings only intensified. But one question that has largely gone unanswered until now is, which side is bigger? The reason this question is so important is because it ultimately was supposed to be used to determine the fate of this beloved series. According to Chris Priestley, the other community manager at Bioware, the Bioware staff were listening to our pleas. It appeared by Bioware's own accounts that the fate of Mass Effect was going to rest in the hands of whichever group could scream the loudest. If Bioware staff were truly listening, then they would no doubt take the side of whichever group held the majority, right? Well, that seemed logical at the time at least. The problem is, nobody seems to know the answer to this question, and many gaming news sites such as Kotaku have believed that the satisfaction ratings for this game have been split right down the middle since the Extended Cut DLC. But in fact, the debate is now more one-sided than you might think when you actually cross-examine all the polls and surveys out there. What makes this problem even more complicated is the fact that Bioware themselves have not distributed regular surveys to keep themselves up to date with the current ebb and flow of the public opinion. So where's Jessica Merzin and the rest of the Bioware staff getting their data from? The release of their recent DLC packages and the way that they have been addressing the public appears to imply that they haven't been taking any player opinions into account at all, but have rather been basing their decisions upon money. For the purpose of this video, I've scoured the internet and tracked down every single relevant public survey, poll, and consensus that exists, and intend to summarize all of the findings together. This video literally holds every single bit of public opinion condensed into data form that is publicly available on the internet at this very moment, and therefore can be deemed as an accurate representation of public opinion. This video is going to look at the polls and public surveys that were taken prior to the Extended Cut DLC, and then the polls and public surveys taken after the release of the Extended Cut DLC, and finally answering the question, did Bioware actually listen to the fans like they promised? Or did they just ride on the coattails of a heated debate among their fanbase in order to make a quick buck? The lack of official Bioware-sponsored surveys appears to indicate the latter. In order to answer this question, let's start off by examining the data that came out after the initial release of the game. As you've probably heard by now, almost everybody hated Mass Effect 3's ending after it first came out. That shouldn't be news to you. The remaining few posters on the Bioware social network now would have you believe otherwise, but in fact, those who enjoyed the ending were, and still are, in the vast minority. I'm not going to reiterate the story of what happened after the release of Mass Effect 3, but instead I'll let the data do the talking. One of the earliest polls, and one of the still most popular ones, was a poll issued by a Bioware social network user by the name of Martyr. The poll was simple and effectively asked, do you like the ending to Mass Effect 3? Over 74,000 people voted, and an overwhelming 91% of them, about 68,204 people, said the endings suck. Only an incredibly minuscule 2% of people enjoyed the endings for what they were after the initial release of the game. Coinciding with this information are a few polls released by other gaming news sites, like one from computerandvideogames.com asking, did Bioware blow it with the ending? Again, an overwhelmingly high 87% of people out of 9,989 people said yes. An IGN-issued Facebook poll asked the same question, are you happy with the way Mass Effect 3 ended? Out of the 17,907 people who answered, 14,086 people said no. That's nearly 79% of the overall vote. Soon after these polls, people began demanding a change that still has yet to come. That very question of should Bioware change the endings was posed by a CNET.com survey that had 20,430 participants, and 83% of the overall voters said yes. Soon after the success of his first poll, Martyr posted yet another popular poll on the Bioware social network forums, offering slightly more clarification and insight for the Bioware staff this time around, asking players what specifically they did not like. The majority of answers, 48%, referenced the chunk of time in the game that players now generally refer to as the ending, which was everything that comes after the beam. This data suggests that Bioware should be focusing purely on the endings until they get it right, which they temporarily did, but they sure didn't get it right yet. It was around this time that the fan-favorite indoctrination theory was developed. We at Clever Noob produced the 3 documentaries on the subject, and then Bioware announced that they were making an extended cut DLC to retcon the endings. Unfortunately, the fans were sorely disappointed by that DLC. But leading up to the Extended Cut DLC, even more polls and surveys came out regarding the topic of what should be done, how the Extended Cut DLC should be executed, and surveys involving the indoctrination theory. What's odd is that every single survey and poll from this time frame clearly shows that the indoctrination theory was the king of the ring and is what a vast majority of Mass Effect fans desperately wanted to see. We'll start off small here. One of the most unnoticed surveys that still managed to be extremely comprehensive and still had a decent amount of responses asked players a variety of questions. 2 of the questions involved the indoctrination theory. The first question posed the hypothetical situation of the indoctrination theory being proven true. Of the 1,374 people polled, 881 of them, 63%, said that they would either happily pay for an indoctrination theory themed DLC or be happy about it being released. 17% felt indifferent, while only 18% would either be somewhat disappointed or severely disappointed. The second question is another hypothetical, assuming the voter believes in the indoctrination theory. The question is essentially asking, does Bioware need to confirm or deny the indoctrination theory, or can they get away with avoiding the topic conversation completely? 59% of respondents believed that the indoctrination theory either needs to be made official and that the Extended Cut DLC should have included this as the ending, or that it can be avoided as long as the Extended Cut DLC provided an equally good answer for all of the plot holes and problems with the original endings. By the way, it didn't. After Bioware announced that the Extended Cut DLC would not be changing the ending, but would rather only add in a few minor scenes, another popular poll on the Bioware social network was created by Cognitor, asking fans if extra scenes was enough, or if Bioware needed to completely redo the ending for them to be happy. Out of the 4,376 voters, a whopping 3,716 of them, 85%, said absolutely not, the ending must be changed. So before the DLC was even released, during a time where Bioware claimed to be listening to the fans were saying that they would only accept a change, not just additional scenes. Bioware did it anyway. In a relatively large and comprehensive survey created by Zolt51 of the Bioware social network forums, over 3,000 people were asked a series of questions pertaining to Mass Effect 3 and the endings and expectations for the Extended Cut DLC. Of particular interest are the questions that ask participants to numerically grade the ending to Mass Effect 3, as well as the rest of the game. Results were consistently low in both categories. Coincidentally, there was a box asking the participants' opinion on the indoctrination theory being a possibility, to which the evident majority said, "must do this." Months later, Zolt51 came out with another survey of the same caliber once the Extended Cut DLC was announced, and it too polled over 3,000 participants. In short, some of the most interesting findings are that over 60% of the people that were polled believed implementing the indoctrination theory was a good move. Of significant interest is that Zolt mentions the fact that Jessica Merzin has been made aware of this poll. Combining that with the "we're listening" message from Chris Priestley, and it appears to be very interesting how Bioware managed to miss the overall majority of the data that was asking for a total rehashing of the endings and to implement the indoctrination theory. To my knowledge, 60% is a pretty sweeping majority, is it not? Anyway, the absolute biggest and widely known about survey that happened during this time frame was one conducted by Mass Effect-universe.de, a German-based website that garnered a lot of attention due to this survey. The most comprehensive survey that covered more than just the ending satisfaction for Mass Effect 3 attracted fans from all over the world. over 25,000 people were participants, ranging from Germany to Russia to the United States and everywhere in between. Not all of them answered every question, but a large majority of them answered the question pertaining to the ending. 12,193 participants, nearly 70%, answered that the endings were terrible with many logical mistakes. It's all the same. 20.1% answered, "Is that all? I've been expecting more than that," while only 3% said they were happy with the ending. Of particular interest is how the indoctrination theory was once again surveyed, and the results showed that nearly 60%, 59.8% to be exact, of the participants believed that the indoctrination theory is true and should be implemented into the Extended Cut DLC, or at some point in the future as a canon ending. This is identical to the results of the last survey asking the same question. So, across two different, completely independent surveys, with one garnering global attention on a massive scale, and one remaining largely unknown, the results were identical? As I've learned from my courses in experimental research in the field of psychology, the number one thing any statistician or researcher looks for when they are trying to determine public opinion is repeatability across multiple studies. These two studies came out at different times, had different people from different cultures and backgrounds, and a vastly different number of participants, and both came out with the same exact results? I'd say that's pretty reliable information. But perhaps the most intriguing of all the studies ever produced is the study that came out after the Extended Cut DLC was released by the very same company that produced the one we were just examining. In this survey, there were 11,942 registered participants coming from 117 different countries. Out of the 11,942 participants, only 9,173 were determined to be valid entries, something no other survey has taken into consideration up until this point. Valid entries meaning entries that were definitely not spam, repeats, etc. The predominant countries making up this 9,173 participant study were Russia, the United States, Germany, and Great Britain in that order. The survey was made available in multiple languages, however 82.5% of participants chose to take this test in English. One of the most answered questions in this survey was the question asking whether or not the indoctrination theory would have served as a better ending than the one fans received in the Extended Cut DLC. The majority believed so, as 53.32% of the participants thought that the indoctrination theory should have been the one included. The opposite viewpoint only accounted for 22.83% of the votes, while 23.85% of the participants were undecided on the matter at the time. In the closing statements of the survey, the researchers acknowledged the fact that EA has been deeply affected by the negative backlash of the game, having been voted as the worst company in America by the Consumerist Report. But the ultimate and main point to take away from this report, according to the researchers, is that time is supposed to heal all wounds, but approximately 6 months later, the general opinion of the original endings remains very poor. While some players really do love the original ending, the clear majority remain very unimpressed. Even after the Extended Cut DLC's release, which was supposed to mend everything over, which included new dialogue with the Catalyst called the Star Child by the fans, only 1/3 of the people surveyed believed that they understood the Catalyst's flow of logic. Only 1/4 of the surveyed participants believed they could influence the outcome of the game themselves. The report claims that by any measure, these are very poor results. Again, this is data that has taken place after the release of the Extended Cut DLC. Also in the closing statements of the report, it sums up the dilemma quite well. For many players, it is clear that their belief in this franchise remains broken. For some, that belief never wavered, but for the majority, it seems fair to summarize, there is appreciation for the issues that were addressed and disappointment that so many issues were left unresolved. Future missteps are a luxury this series can ill afford. Sadly, Future Missteps describes Bioware's actions in the following 6 months pretty perfectly. And finally, there is a new poll on the Bioware social network forums created by Darth Brotarian that came out just earlier this morning, at the time of this narration recording that is, which is growing in popularity at a substantial rate. That makes it the most recent and relevant poll out there, because this poll encompasses the opinions of the fans after they have been exposed to all of the recent DLC, with the exception of the Citadel DLC, which will drop in little over a week on March 5th, 2013. Having only been out for less than a day after the announcement of the Citadel DLC, this poll already garnered over 500 responses, 519 to be precise. And while that's not the same as the large numbers we've had before, that's a lot considering it's been one day. Check back in about a week and I guarantee that number is going to skyrocket, with the results remaining closely the same despite the new voters. So there are 8 options that can be divided into 2 categories. People who like the ending or at the very least can accept it, and people who are still unhappy with the ending at varying degrees and want it to be fixed once and for all. While the last option on this list appears to have been made with comedy in mind, I personally feel that it was a little over the top. Anywho, the current results are astonishingly similar to what we've already seen. The first category of people who either like or who can at the very least accept the endings for what they are account for only 33.9% of the total votes. While on the other hand, the people who still aren't happy with the ending account for a whopping 66% of the votes. That's right, 66%, just like how every single other survey we've looked at so far since the Extended Cut DLC's release have roughly been within the 60 percentile dissatisfaction range. That makes 3 completely separate surveys and polls that reached out to 3 completely different audiences at 3 completely different times since the release of the Extended Cut DLC, garnering the same exact results. About 60 to 66% of all Mass Effect fans still aren't happy, and the majority of them want the indoctrination theory. Those are the facts, and don't let anybody try to deceive you otherwise. Even if you look at the poll differently by cutting it into 3 categories instead of 2, with people who enjoy the ending as one category, people who feel slightly indifferent about it as another category, and people who still don't like the endings as the last category, the third category is still more than twice the size of the other categories, coming in at 55.6%. I've been monitoring this poll throughout the entire day, and the percentages have remained relatively constant, fluctuating only 1 to 2% up and down throughout the day since the very second it was posted. Couple that with all of the data shown previously, and it's pretty safe to say that the dominant opinion is that Bioware still has to address the ending in a major way before this popular consensus will change in Bioware's favor. In closing, an important thing to note is that the scales have begun to get closer to a balancing point since day 1 of Mass Effect 3's release, with more people becoming content with Mass Effect 3's ending now that the newer DLC has released. However, the sweeping majority is clearly still those who dislike or even hate the ending of Mass Effect 3. This shows that Bioware has made improvements, but it also shows that the strong majority of fans are not going to forget about this issue or let it go until it's properly addressed by Bioware. This is a situation of almost doesn't cut it. It's also important to note that the increase in satisfied fans is not a growing trend, because the majority of fans over the last 6 months have remained relatively stable at the 60% dissatisfaction rate that we've spoken of. The reason for this increase was due to the Extended Cut DLC, which satisfied only an additional 20% of the fan base. But ever since the Extended Cut DLC, those numbers have remained largely unchanged. Having made this video in as neutral of a mindset as humanly possible, the facts are that the fans still are not happy. They won't be until the endings are changed. I'm not sure where Jessica Marzin and the rest of the Bioware crew have gotten their rumor data from, but the real data out there shows that Bioware has not been listening to their fans. Even if Bioware did conduct their own research, it clearly did not include a big enough sample size to offset the sheer volume of polls and surveys conducted by independent companies and individuals over the last year, and specifically the last 6 months. So whatever statements Bioware makes regarding this topic are immediately nullified by these facts. Let them say what they will, but facts are facts. So here's this video summed up. Every single survey out there shows that the fans who are upset with the ending of Mass Effect 3 still make up the vast majority of all Mass Effect 3 fans. No matter how hard I tried, I was not able to find even one survey or poll, big or small, from any time frame during this past year's debacle that said differently. Not one. So Bioware, do you acknowledge this data as the factual evidence that it is, or do you continue to hide behind your community managers who spew lies to deceive your fanbase into believing what you want them to? Wait, that sounds a lot like something we've heard before. But anyway, as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out clevernoobs.com if you'd like to discuss this further with us. Don't forget to subscribe, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. By the way, there are links to all the surveys and polls referenced in this video in the description below if you want to check out this data for yourself, because unlike Bioware, our data is actually publicly available. Should Bioware do the right thing and finally change these endings, their immortality as a gaming legend will forever be remembered. Should they ignore the facts presented here and continue down the path of ignorance and greed, well, then we'll all be saying rest in peace to Bioware pretty soon. The ball is in your court, Bioware. The vast majority of your fans are still waiting.
I'm done. Just, nope, not doing it. No. That's pretty much what it means. I hope that didn't break.